Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to 2020, a new year and a new decade. And a special welcome to today's webinar, Beyond Antipsychotics and Non-Pharmacological Interventions, a Well-Being Approach. This is the first in our series that we are doing on Alzheimer's and dementia care and the Greenhouse Project's Best Life Approach. And if you're like me, it's pretty hot topic, something that I think has generated a lot of interest. In fact, today's webinar, we have close to 300 people that registered for this. So certainly the interest is there. I am Susan Ryan. I am the Senior Director of the Greenhouse Project. So I'm eager to get into today's webinar, but before we do, I have just a few housekeeping details and want to talk to you about an exciting future opportunity. So first of all, you are in listen-only mode, but towards the end of our session today, you will be able to put your questions and your comments in the chat box, and I will share those with our speaker today. You should know that the session is being recorded, and a link and a survey will come about an hour after the session is completed. Eager to get your feedback on today's session, as well as we're happy for you to take this link and to continue to learn and grow from it. So let's get started. I'm going to talk to you first of all about a future opportunity that I'm really excited about. It's kind of the first of its kind that the Greenhouse Project has endeavored to do. We are doing a dementia symposium. We've called it Beyond Memory Care, a Dementia Wellbeing Approach. It is really building upon our Best Life Memory Care approach. And if you like what you hear today with Dr. Al Power's session, you're going to really want to be with us in Little Rock, Arkansas, May 18. For more information and to make sure that you register for this event, you'll see the link down there at the bottom. That will take you to our website and the web page that is specifically about this incredible opportunity. May 18, 2020, Beyond Memory Care, a Dementia Wellbeing Approach. So let's get started with today's session, and I'm going to introduce my good friend, Dr. Al Power. Dr. Al Power is an internist, he's a geriatrician, which we all know finding a good geriatrician these days, not so easy. So he is a geriatrician. More than that, he's an author of 2 books, Dementia Beyond Disease and Dementia Beyond Drugs. And I recommend both of those if you don't have them. If you have anything to do with supporting people living with dementia, those are 2 resources that you'll want to have on hand. He's an incredible educator, and a trait that you may not know is that he's a very gifted musician as well. Currently, he is working at Schlegel Villages. He's the chair in the Aging and Dementia Innovation. He is respected internationally in his work in the reduction of antipsychotics. Again, this is an incredible topic for us to consider today with everything that we're trying to do with CMS regulations. I'm really excited for you to hear everything Dr. Power will share with us today about his unique and incredible approach. So Al, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Susan, and welcome everybody to the webinar. It's great to have so many people signed up so early in January. So I'm happy to share some ideas with you. What I'd like to do is to try to push the envelope a little bit about some different ways of looking at dementia, because I think that when we get stuck in certain traditional ways of looking at it, we get stuck in the same approaches to try to find solutions. And sometimes we don't see what other solutions are until we get outside that box a bit. So one thing I'm going to do on this talk is to really challenge a very common expression, which you see in the media and which you see in many, many medical textbooks, journals, and courses. And that is this concept of what is often referred to as BPSD. And what BPSD officially stands for is Behavioral and Psychological Symptoms of Dementia. Although I'm going to suggest here that maybe it could also stand for biomedical paradigm support drugging. In other words, when you see something a certain way, it may lead you toward using medications that might not be helpful. And so I'm going to dive into that a little bit. This is still sort of the accepted language. So you're going to see it all over the place. Also in the US, you also see the abbreviation NPS, which stands for Neuropsychological Symptoms of Dementia. And once again, I'm going to challenge these ideas and say maybe this framework is something we have to get beyond if we really want to get those solutions that we have not found yet. So I'm going to start this with a bit of a challenge for all of you. And I'm going to ask you a very provocative question. And that question is, do we maybe hold people living with dementia to a higher standard, a higher emotional standard, a higher behavioral standard than we actually hold ourselves? So I'll give you some examples. What you and I might do on a daily basis is go for a walk. We might explore, we might get our Fitbits and do our steps. Or if we don't like what's going on, we might get bored and leave. But of course, when people with dementia do these things, they wander, they elope, or they exit seek. You and I may get restless when we force people in, when we're forced into other people's rhythms, whereas people with dementia actually sundown. We shop in bulk at Costco and stores like that. People with dementia, of course, are hoarders. We may get angry, sad, anxious, or frustrated because those are what we consider normal human emotions. But people with dementia are exhibiting challenging behaviors. And lastly, we don't like being locked up, bossed around, or touched by strangers. People with dementia are resistive, agitated, or aggressive. So once again, when we put the label of dementia in front of the person, we take things that you or I might experience and we actually start to see them and describe them differently. So what is the problem with seeing these as symptoms of brain disease? Well, when we relegate people's expressions, their words and actions to being caused by brain disease, and that's what a symptom is. A symptom is something you feel or express that's a sign of a disease. So we're ignoring a lot of other factors, relational factors, environmental factors, historical factors that could be affecting what the person is saying or doing. In doing so, we tend to pathologize many normal expressions, as I just described. I think that our systems of categorization are flawed. They're kind of vague and don't really describe what's going on. I'm not really sure why we have scales that measure agitation, because agitation is such a thermal term for a million different things that could be going on. Does that really help us get insight? And does it really help us look at ourselves as opposed to just the person and blame the person for whatever's going on? I actually think this framework has created a slippery slope to medication use and actually has been the biggest barrier to reducing antipsychotics, because if you believe something is a symptom of disease, of course you're going to use a pill. That's how we treat diseases. And you might follow the usual dictum that we have to try non-pharmacological approaches first. But if you truly believe these are symptoms of brain disease, then your default is going to be, okay, try one or two things. And if they don't work right away, which they often don't, then say, okay, well, we tried. Let's go back to the pills because the non-pharmacological approach. It doesn't explain how drug use has been successfully eliminated in many homes. In the US today, there are 150 nursing homes on average, 150, 160 that are using 0% antipsychotics, and hundreds more that might be using 3% or fewer. So if this is a brain disease that can't be cured, how are they doing that? We tend to misapply labels because this seeing things as disease leads us down the road to psychiatric labels like delusions and hallucinations. And, this has even led to inappropriate drug approvals in some countries, because once again, legitimizing a framework like BPSD kind of legitimizes using drugs. And even where I'm sitting today in Canada, certain drugs have been approved, even though they're not approved in the US, and even though the research shows that they're potentially dangerous, some countries can legally use these without the same degree of scrutiny. Now, I'm not saying we do everything right with dementia care in the US. We have a lot to learn from other countries. But one thing that we did do, I believe, absolutely correctly in the US was we never approved an antipsychotic for dementia. And so we haven't, even though they're used, of course, it's off-label use. There's no federal sanction to the use of these drugs. And I think when you put that in place, the other countries that are using these drugs legally have got to walk that back now that they are finding all the problems with these drugs. And it's much harder to do when you have officially moved the drugs. So I'm glad we didn't do that in the US. It makes it just a little bit easier for us to consider stopping. So dementia is real, okay? I'm not here to say that it's some kind of social construct or that people's brains haven't changed or that they don't have real cognitive problems. But the question I'm asking is dementia really the root cause of people's actions? And I just want to share a little very simplistic exercise with you to kind of illustrate that. And that is, suppose I were going to take everybody on the call today and say, okay, we're going to try a fun exercise. I'm going to pair you up with whoever happens to be sitting next to you, or if you're alone, maybe whoever's down the hall, and that person is going to take you to a shower room and strip you naked and give you a shower. Now, how many people are anxious to do something like that? My guess is that people currently are laughing nervously or saying, no way, I'm going to do that. The truth is, it's very difficult to have somebody strip you naked and provide personal care like that, very intimate care. That has nothing to do with dementia. That's a difficult thing for any of us to subject ourselves to. And so people with dementia become distressed for largely the same reasons that any of us would. There is a difference, and that difference is, what does dementia cause? Well, some of the symptoms of dementia do cause a change in our communication abilities. So our ability to verbalize our feelings or needs may change. Our ability to remember information that helps us feel secure or in control. And our ability to cope with stressful situations may be impaired as well. So that causes a difference in a stressful situation. And just taking that shower as an example, if one of your coworkers was about to give you a shower and the water was too cold, you or I might say, hey, the water's too cold, or we might reach over and turn the knob so that we can get the temperature to our liking. A person living with dementia who is impaired as far as their ability to communicate or cope with those types of situations might not be able to do that. So they might yell out, they might even strike out at you while you're trying to get the shower. That's what the dementia has done. The dementia has changed the way we respond to the stress. But the dementia is not the root cause. The root cause was that the water was too cold. And if we see what the person does as a symptom of dementia, we might try interventions, either pills or non-pharmacological approaches that try to help the person calm down. And we might never realize we have to turn the temperature of the water up. And this is the problem with seeing this as a symptom of brain disease. Now, that's pretty simplistic, but if you look at all the different things that people may express that may be causes of distress for people, you can see that you can apply this to many, many situations. And I'm going to show you a different framework later for looking at that differently. So what is represented by people's words and actions most of the time? Up here in Canada, Schlegel Villages, we refer to these as personal expressions. That to me is a little less judgmental than saying challenging behaviors or even responsive behaviors. Even the word behavior becomes kind of pejorative, I think, in our language when we talk about people with dementia. So what are those words and actions representing? Well, I have 7 categories here that I think apply to the vast majority of these things. The first one is either unmet needs or challenges to their well-being, which is something I'll describe in more detail. A second one might be sensory challenges, because the 5 senses are changed with aging and with a diagnosis of dementia. And if we don't realize that people might be feeling the water differently or seeing things or hearing things differently because of aging or because of dementia, we might not understand how we need to provide care differently. People may have different communication pathways. So if they can't say the words they used to say, they might speak with more symbolic or emotion-based language, or they might speak through their actions and not use words at all. So these words and actions are expressions of agency, an attempt to try to exert some control over an environment that is more and more becoming out of our control. They may be different ways of interpreting or problem solving. We're doing the best we can with the information we have at hand. And it may look bizarre to people around us, but it's actually our ability to try to put some sense to our world. My friend Sonia Barsness, who's a gerontologist, says people with dementia are not problem causers, they're actually problem solvers. And we need to understand how people are solving problems with the information they have at hand. It could be a response to physical or relational aspects of the environment, the way we're being approached by a care partner, or something about the physical environment that may be affecting us. And as we talked about up front, it could be a perfectly normal reaction considering the circumstances. The important thing, as you can see from the asterisks on this list, is that there will never be any kind of a pill that will solve any of these 7 categories. And so if you believe, as I do, that the majority of people's distress is related to these things, then you can understand why we get in trouble when we use medications. So one way I like to help people shift their paradigm is, say, suppose you were asked to see somebody who seemed distressed and you were trying to figure out what's going on and how to help them. If you listen to what most of our training says, which is over 90% of people living with dementia will experience a BPSD during the course of their illness, think about what that makes you think as far as what's the cause of the distress, how much it is due to the person versus other aspects of the environment, and how useful a pill might be for someone like that. Instead, think of how you might see that person differently if you were taught that over 90% of people living with dementia would find themselves in a situation in which their well-being is not adequately supported. Now, where do you think the cause is? Where do you think pills fit into the list of things that might be a successful response? Once again, just by looking at this differently, framing it with a different question, we can see a person in the situation completely differently than we might have previously. I'd like to share a little story from my first book, Dementia Beyond Drugs, of a gentleman who I'm calling Ray. This was shared to me by one of my Eden gurus, Carol Endy, who used to work at the Juneau Pioneer Home in Alaska. And so I'll read this story from my book and share with you an example of a very difficult situation that actually had a solution outside of medications. Ray was a very large man who often had difficulty expressing himself and making his needs known. He spoke loudly, and when he was having a bad time, he would often shout, strike out, or even throw objects. On one particularly difficult day, Ray became so frustrated that he picked up a computer monitor at the nurse's station and threw it, creating a dangerous situation. The staff called for an emergency response and the police arrived. When they walked in, Ray shouted, "Thank God you're here. These people are trying to hurt me." One of the officers replied that they would take him to a safe place to, quote, get away from these people and be sure he was okay. So Ray willingly left with them and was taken to the hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. After Ray left, the staff worked to calm everyone who lived and worked in the area. The administrator sat down with his team and surprised them when he asked, "How did we fail Ray?" Well, the team members' initial response was to blame Ray's, quote, aggressiveness and to look at the shortcomings of others. But the administrator reminded them that after a period of sedation and evaluation, the hospital would certainly be pressing them to take Ray back. He encouraged them to see Ray as a teacher, challenging them about the shortcomings of their system of care and support. How do we make this into a home that Ray wants to come back to? Right now, if I were Ray, I would not want to come back here. He does not feel in control, he is not being heard, and he feels people don't like him. He's right on all counts. And right now, I have more understanding around why Ray threw that computer than around why we were not able to help Ray before he became so frustrated. In working to find a different approach, the team shared as much information as they could about Ray, including his past work and contributions to the Juneau community. They then decided to try a role play. A nurse who knew him well agreed to imagine how it would feel to be Ray. Taking all she knew about him, she walked around the living area, attempting to view it through his eyes. This tour of the living area produced several insights. It was clear that Ray was intimidating, even frightening, to staff and other elders alike. As a result, people tended to avoid him, walking away when he approached. Even the team members would often simply give a perfunctory hello and then quickly disengage. From Ray's point of view, the message was clear. We don't like you. The negative body language that surrounded Ray was contributing to his own feelings of isolation and loneliness. Ray often approached the nursing station, but was quickly redirected so that people could continue with their tasks. The role play now revealed that Ray was searching for connectedness. There was no place where he was welcome, no person to whom he could turn for comfort or companionship. Armed with their new knowledge, a new plan was adopted for Ray's return. The team members and other elders were educated about who Ray was and what he had done in his life. His care partners took pains to greet him warmly whenever they saw him and spent time talking to him. Those who felt safe to do so would give him a pat on the shoulder or even a brief hug. They set up 2 spaces for Ray to sit, one by the nursing station and one in the lounge where he enjoyed looking out the window. They didn't take him to either of these places. Restoring Ray's sense of choice and control was key. But when he moved to one of these spots, they would engage him with conversation, photographs, or a cup of coffee. The result of this transformation of the system was the transformation in Ray's demeanor. Although he did not live long enough for the eventual physical transformation of the living area, the changes in interpersonal interactions and the restoration of all aspects of his well-being created an environment where he could live without further dangerous outbursts. So once again, here's somebody who created what seemed to be one of those really dangerous situations where how could you possibly care for this person without giving him a sedating medication? And yet, through looking at things differently, the team was able to come up with a very successful approach that helped Ray for the remainder of his life after he returned to the home. So in thinking about that story, I asked the question, which medication do you know of that would have helped Ray? And once again, to a saying which, once again, my friend Sonia Barsness often says, there is no medication that strengthens well-being. So how can we look about this differently now that we know that we have a narrow view that doesn't quite give us the answers we need? How do we shift our paradigms and look at something different? Well, what I talk about in my books and my teachings is an approach that has some different pillars. And I started my first book with a quote by the French author Marcel Proust, who said, the only true voyage of discovery would be not to visit strange lands, but to possess other eyes, to behold the universe through the eyes of another, of 100 others, to behold the 100 universes that each of them beholds, that each of them is. This is not about anything new that I or anyone else invented that wasn't there before. This is only about taking a very old illness and saying, how can we see it differently? And the magical thing about that is that everybody can do that. You don't need any letters after your name or any special training to look at a person or a situation and say, how can I see this differently than I did before? So the approach that I teach rests upon three basic pillars. The first is redefining dementia not only as brain disease, but really more holistically as shifting experience. The second pillar is using a framework for well-being as our primary goal. And the third is the culture change part, transforming the care and living environment to better support the first two. I'm going to take these one at a time. The first one is the definition that I wrote in my first book over a decade ago, and this is probably the one thing that I can say I have not changed in evolving the way I think about people living with dementia and how best to support them. I redefine dementia simply by saying it's a shift in the way a person experiences the world around her or him. Now, that doesn't exclude brain disease, but it says let's not just see it very narrowly as neuropathology. And instead, let's just look at it through the eyes of that individual. How is that person experiencing or perceiving the world is different than the way she or he maybe used to before they were living with significant changes in their brain. And it's kind of a fuzzy definition. It wouldn't help you find a new drug, but I think for most of us who are providing care and support, this actually takes us outside that box and helps us see things we couldn't see before. So I found when I started using this very fuzzy definition, that road led me down a very different path than what I was following as a doctor with more traditional training. One thing it did was it opened me up to the individual experiences of people living with dementia. And I often quote my good friend, the late Dr. Richard Taylor, who first time I heard him speak said something very powerful. He said, I'm not dying of a fatal disease. I'm living with a chronic disability. And that did a couple things. First of all, it changed the focus from dying to living. And secondly, changed the focus from disease to disability, or if you will, a changing ability. Dementia certainly is based on the disease or injury or condition of the brain that is structurally, chemically different than it used to be. But from the social model of disability, any disease or injury can lead us to be living with a disability because it may change our ability to engage society the way we need to without some assistance. And so just like other disabilities, we can say that with proper accommodations, we can help people with dementia to live better. And I began thinking about physical disabilities, and I began thinking about people, for example, in wheelchairs. And what would happen if someone tried to get into a building that only had 10 steps to get in? Well, if that person couldn't walk outside the wheelchair, then that person could not get in the building and engage with the people inside. And I realized that what we're doing with dementia is regardless of where you live, whether you're at home or in long-term care or anywhere in between, we take people whose brains and experiences are changing and we expect them to follow our view of the world, our rhythms, our schedules, our staffing needs. And that's like asking the person in the wheelchair to walk up those 10 steps because that's what we do. And if the person can't do it and becomes angry or frustrated, then we give a potentially dangerous medication and call it a behavior. Kind of a ridiculous thing when you think about that, but that's exactly what we do in all living environments for people living with dementia. When you see dementia more through the lens of disability, you say, okay, what are some of the accommodations we can provide to help this person with changing experience continue to engage as successfully and as meaningfully as possible? It's about changing ourselves and creating an environment that better adapts to that person's changing needs. And that's what we do for people with other disabilities all the time. It also was kind of an interesting definition that I've discovered recently. It's been kind of subversive in a way, because what do we do when we have these challenges in care? Well, we usually call doctors. We even call specialists like neurologists or psychiatrists because they're the experts. And what do we get from doctors? Well, we get pills because that's what doctors do. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And let's face it, dementia is an extremely complex condition, family of conditions that affects the brain, which is maybe the most complex thing in the whole universe. I personally don't understand all those different structures in the brain and what they do. And if we're going to continue to define dementia as brain disease, then we're going to continue to rely on those specialists who understand the brain to help us. And that's why we tend to get lots of antipsychotics and other medications. But think about what happens when you redefine dementia as a shift in the experience of the world. Who is the expert on how the person is experiencing the world? Well, that person is the expert and the people who are closest to her, which could be either professional or family care partners. And so this totally flips the hierarchy of who the experts are. And so if someone was struggling with personal care, we don't go to neurologists, psychiatrists. We say, what can we learn from the person and those closest to that person as far as where the solutions lie? So this totally changes who the experts are and where we go when we start to brainstorm these challenges. This has challenged me to look at the way we interpret distress, as you've just heard. It's challenged me to look at different living environments and how they're set up. So really, for me, a very simple definition switch like this changed everything I saw when it came to dementia. The second pillar is to not just try to mitigate disease, but to try to enhance well-being. Why would we want to do that? Well, there are some benefits of focusing on well-being and not just illness. First of all, we don't deny that there's disease, but we see the illness in the context of the whole person. We destigmatize those personal expressions and don't just blame them on brain disease. We understand that there are other contexts, and we focus not just on curing disease, which we can't do at this point in time, but what are those achievable, life-affirming goals that we should be working on for every individual, regardless of whether there's a new pill available or not. It gives important new insights. It helps not only reduce, but even eliminate the use of drugs like antipsychotics. But the most important thing is it's proactive and is strength-based. Most of the things that available trainings teach us are reactive and deficit-based, even when it comes to non-pharmacological approaches, we'll mention soon. In my books, I chose one framework for viewing well-being, and this came from a white paper that was written based on a grant in 2004 from the Eden Alternative. They have since trademarked this as the Eden Alternative Domains of Well-Being, and there are 7 different aspects of well-being that they talk about, which I have rearranged in an order that makes more sense to me for teaching purposes. And so those domains of well-being are identity, connectedness, security, autonomy, meaning, growth, and joy. I would argue that these are 7 aspects of life that are important to all individuals, regardless of your age, your nationality, your ethnicity, your faith tradition, or whether you live with any medical diagnoses or not. These things are important to everybody. But the problem is that when you live with a condition like dementia, it's more difficult to maintain these aspects of well-being on your own. And if the people who support you are not aware that these are that vitally important, and if it's not woven into our training, then these things go unaddressed for people who live with dementia. And what we find is that our care systems not only do not recognize these important needs, but we often do things that erode these domains of well-being even more than the disease itself would. And so we have people who are suffering because of a lack of well-being, and we not only recognize that we sometimes make the situation worse. A perfect example would be rotating care staff. So if we do that, then the person who is stripping you naked and giving you a shower, as we talked about, is a parade of strangers for a person who has trouble at the beginning remembering. So this affects obviously the domain of connectedness because we don't have continuous relationships, but it also is a whole domino effect. It affects our sense of security. It affects our sense of choice and control because if you're rotating around and don't know people well, you're not going to have them exercise choice because you won't trust them to be able to make safer choices. And you can go right down the list and see how a simple operational practice like that can affect the many domains of well-being. The third pillar is transformation. And in culture change, we talk about 3 different aspects of transformation. There's certainly personal transformation. And in this context, how we see people live with dementia, as we've been talking about, and also the interpersonal domain of our dimension of how we interact with and support individuals with dementia. Physical transformation, well, people in the greenhouse model know a lot about that. It's creating living environments that support the values of home, not institutions, and support different aspects of well-being. But the third pillar, which I consider the linchpin, is the operation pillar. Because neither a beautiful mindset or a beautiful building will transform anything if we continue to have systems of care and support that are based on institutional mindsets. So some of the aspects of operational transformation may be how decisions are made that affect people with dementia, who's at the table when decisions are being made, how do we empower both people living with dementia and their care partners, how do we communicate information, how do we address conflict, how do we create care partnerships. It even comes down to job descriptions and performance measures, because once again, we tend to follow practices that reinforce what systems reinforce our jobs and our paychecks. And if we don't get that deep with operational transformation, we can get people to think differently or act. So maybe the biggest challenge is why non-pharmacological interventions don't work. That's a pretty provocative thing for a guy who wrote Dementia Beyond Drugs to say, but it was my pathway early on in my days of working in long-term care and trying to address these challenges and trying that list of non-pharmacological interventions and finding that they often didn't solve the problem. It took me a while to figure this out, but I heard a story I want to share with you, and it may not apply to everybody you care for, but once again, it's a lesson that we can then extend to other situations. I was speaking for the Iowa Association out in eastern Iowa many years ago and heard a story about a man who moved into assisted living, who lived with Alzheimer's and had a lot of trouble verbalizing his needs. And from day one, he kept trying to go out the door into the backyard. And because people didn't want him leaving the building, they would constantly redirect him, and they came up with all this list of things to try to engage him in, but he just became more and more insistent. And after a few days of fighting with this gentleman who couldn't really express his needs, the manager said, listen, it's a nice day out. We have a fence out there. Why don't you let him go once and see what he's doing? And so he went out back, and there was a fence that adjoined a cow pasture. And he stood there and he watched the herd of cows for a while. This was Iowa after all. And after about 15 minutes, he walked back indoors and he sat down and he was calm all day. Now, when they were able to discuss this with his family, this care plan, the family said, well, he was a farmer all his life. He probably saw the cows out the window and wanted to check on the herd. That was what he did. Now, that is not necessarily the case with everybody you care for, but once again, there's a lesson here. And that is, suppose we live in an area that is secured. What do we do when people try to exit the building? Well, we may try music and memory. We might try aromatherapy. We might try hand massage. We might try folding laundry. You know, those might be good interventions at certain points in time for some individuals. But what if we got a gentleman who wants to check on the cows? Is any of those things ever going to solve things? It may quiet him for the moment or engage him momentarily, but eventually he's going to be back trying to do what he was trying to do. And if we don't understand him as an individual, then none of these things is going to work. And unfortunately, that's the problem with our non-pharmacologic approaches. We tend to do them with this biomedical mindset. They tend to be reactive, not proactive. They tend to not have any individual meaning for that unique individual who's expressing something that we don't understand. It's not tied into those well-being domains, and we actually treat these things just like pills. We either give them PRN, when they get distressed, do this, or we do them on a regular basis. Let's have them fold laundry every day, whether it helps him with what he really needs or expresses or not. And the biggest thing is it's superimposed on the usual care environment. So if you're thinking not about cows, but about well-being domains, if the person doesn't have choice or control, if they don't have meaningful relationships, if they don't feel safe or secure, then folding washcloths or having aromatherapy or sitting and listening to music for a half hour isn't really going to address the underlying root needs or causes. And so eventually we're just going to get back to where we are whenever a pill wears off. We're back with the person just repeating this expression over and over again without ever getting to the root cause. So I want to just briefly talk about the well-being approach, which I describe in my second book, Dementia Beyond Disease. And I will describe the approach in very rough detail and some application of this, which you will hear about if you come to that seminar on May 18th from Dr. Angela Norman from Arkansas. But very quickly, we can use these well-being domains for ongoing support and care as part of our care plans or well-being plans. We can also use them for decoding distress. I love this saying, people who wonder whether the glass is half empty or half full are missing the point. The glass is refillable. So even though people have lost a certain aspect of well-being, we can start to replenish those glasses. And so let's look at those 7 well-being domains as 7 glasses that may be challenged, that maybe we're going to try to fill to some extent. And so the key is when we look at people to say, how full is each of these glasses? How full is this person's glass for identity or her glass for connectedness or security? And if those glasses are getting rather empty, what are ways that we can proactively fill those glasses in our care plan for that person? And it's not just to respond to an episode of distress, but it's proactively, 24/7. So in other words, stop trying to, quote, fix the behavior, and instead, let's create some ramps. But instead of wheelchair ramps, these are ramps to the different aspects of well-being. How has this been used in real practice? Well, since I've developed this approach, I've been mostly teaching and traveling. I haven't had my own cohort of elders to care for, to use it with. I used it a bit at St. John's before I left and have used it in my consultations. But fortunately, we have people like Dr. Norman, who has been using this with her consulting team through many homes across the state of Arkansas. And we're so pleased that Angela will be at the Greenhouse Conference to share some updated experience, but I'll give you some of the early work that she has done with this well-being approach. She initially started by going to one provider in Arkansas who oversees several different long-term care communities and asked for 4 of those who he felt were struggling with antipsychotic use. She began to work with the team on enhancing well-being domains for all those elders living with dementia, both proactively and then shifting system support those changes. What she reported to me was that in the first 6 months of doing this, 3 out of the 4 homes had had a relative reduction in their antipsychotic rate of between 61 and 71%, and increased satisfaction numbers as well. And in a year later update, all continued to improve, and one home had had more than 90% relative reduction. Now, at the beginning, only 3 out of 4 homes had succeeded. The 4th was only 18% improved. And when I asked her why was that other one struggling still, and you might be surprised or you might not, the difference was that leadership had not gotten on board and worked to embrace and drive the approach. So once again, this is not just the job of the hands-on team members, but also it is important for formal leaders to embrace and support this approach, to have people's backs, to help them to understand how important it is. This is not just a talk for people who are providing direct support, but for everybody involved in the organization. What happened, though, was things have progressed in the past year or 2 since that happened. The state of Arkansas came to Dr. Norman's team and said, we're going to send you to the 25 highest prescribing homes in the state. Let's see what happens if you bring the approach to them. Well, after 6 months, which is now a while back, I have to get an update from Dr. Norman, but after 6 months, she reported that antipsychotics were reduced by 49% among those highest prescribing homes using it. They are also supporting the teams from nearly 100 homes across the state, and they greatly reduced their geri psych transfers from quite a few to almost none. And so the latest report I got from Dr. Norman is they started working last year with a group of 16 geropsychiatrists who are supporting several homes in this cohort. And they wrote up a protocol for them and the teams to work with before they transferred somebody out. And they went from the month before the launch of the cohort to having, I believe it was 28 people having been transferred to geropsych in that month from those homes, to the next month only having one. So once again, this has been a very successful approach in not only reducing medication significantly, but reducing the number of people whose needs can't be met on site. Because we know what happens when people go to geropsych. It's not that they aren't good people, but those are crisis management organizations. This is a place where people are going to get put on drugs like antipsychotics. They're going to be sedated, they may be restrained, and when things quiet down, they're going to want you to take the person back. They're not culture change organizations. They're not going to give you a lot of innovative approaches that will help you care differently when the person returns to your community. So if we can stop sending people out, that's better. And I want to get back to finish up those two roads that diverged in the yellow wood that I showed you a picture of before, and show you the absolute extreme of where those two different roads can go when you start defining dementia differently. We can say that those people that lived in those homes that Dr. Norman's group worked with didn't go out to geropsych, and that probably was to their benefit in many ways. But there was a big grant that came out from the National Institute of Aging, $10 million given to 4 centers, including Harvard, Emory, including the Mayo Clinic. And what they're going to start doing now is they're going to start giving electroconvulsive therapy to people with dementia who are exhibiting extreme distress, or what they call agitated or aggressive behaviors. I consider this a pretty drastic intervention for people, which once again is the extreme of BPSD. This is where you go when you believe these are symptoms of brain disease. Unfortunately, electroconvulsive therapy has a lot of controversies as to side effects, even for people with normal brains who are living with severe depression. And it really has not been well studied in people with damaged brains and what it could do to people's ability to remember and other aspects of cognitive health. So it's a pretty invasive procedure. And I could argue, the interesting thing about these studies is that the referral source for electroconvulsive therapy is they're going to use people who are sent to geropsych units by long-term care homes. So I can argue that if those people who are getting electroshock therapy happen to live in Arkansas, they might not get the therapy because Dr. Norman's group and their homes would not have sent them out in the first place. So that's the extreme of these diverging roads. One group is taking care of people without medications. The other group is getting electroconvulsive therapy in specialized centers. That is the danger of something that might seem like semantics, not agreeing with a terminology like BPSD, but this is where it can take you if you take that to the extremes in either direction. So I want to leave you with a quote by my good friend, Dr. Richard Taylor, who lived with Alzheimer's for about 15 years before passing away from cancer about 4.5 years ago. And Richard once said, people talk about person-centered care, but if the view of the person doesn't change, then centering on them actually makes it worse. So thanks again for your attention. We have about 15 minutes, I believe, in the hour, and I'd be happy to hear comments, questions about anything that relates to this. Thanks again, everybody, and thanks, Susan and the gang at the Greenhouse office.
Al, thank you so much. This has been fabulous. I think every time I hear a webinar that you do, I learn more and more. So we do have a few questions. So the first one has said, how does a person go about finding a provider who embraces and practices these ideas of enhancing well-being?
That is a great question. I think the best way to do it is to start by making sure that that is part of our savvy consumerism. So as we go around and evaluate a community for our loved ones or our friends' loved ones, we should start asking certain questions. Like, are you doing any kind of culture change would be the first one maybe, but then you can really get into specifics. Do you rotate your team members, or do you have the same people caring for my loved one? Will she have a parade of strangers taking off her clothes and giving her a shower? or will it be people that she knows and trusts? Do you know anything about this work on well-being? Have you read these books? I've had several people actually take copies of my books, not to my books, but they could be other people's books. It could be, whatever model you like, but taking copies of that book and handing them to administrators or directors of nursing and saying, have you read this book? Do you know anything about this? Are you doing anything like this? What are your approaches to people with dementia? Not really people. Once again, that is kind of the ultimate arbiter of whether homes change, is whether the people that are going to live there or are going to encourage their loved ones to live there are interested in the way you. So I think the bottom line is going to come from the public. And I think the more we educate the public and make them more savvy, the better we can do. I'm sure the Greenhouse has resources. I also know that there's a resource on the Pioneer Network page that can give you some savvy questions that people can ask when they are touring long-term care homes or assisted living to find out if people have embraced some of these values or not. I hope that answers the question.
Great. So next question, you may have mentioned, but did the Arkansas study look at staffing ratio and if the proactive steps were effective even with different staffing ratios?
I don't want to speak for Angela, and hopefully she'll tell us a lot more about that in May. What I've found in my practice and with the organizations I've supported personally, and in the culture change work I've done at St. John's in the past, is that we did not change ratios. We got great results simply by doing differently with the people we had. Now, I have to say that with a grain of salt, because I have talked to some people whose ratios are so high that I'm not sure anybody can be successful. So, at St. John's, it was fairly typical in our legacy home on a day shift to have maybe 8 aides caring for, one aide caring for 8 different elders. And maybe it'll be 1 to 12 on nights or on evenings or weekends. When somebody comes to me and says, well, we got 1 to 20, what can I do with that? I throw up my hands and I say, that gets a little ridiculous when you get up high. But the point is, you don't have to have 1 to 2 staffing. And the truth is that even if you have 1-to-1 ratios, if you have the wrong view of dementia, you're going to over-medicate people and not meet their needs. So it's really about working differently, not getting more people. And the truth is, that's our reality. When you look at aging demographics, how many old people there will be compared to how many younger people, and where we're going with long-term care, we will never have higher staff ratios. That's the bottom line. And Greenhouse is blessed to have higher ratios, but of course, we have versatile workers who are doing more than just providing hands-on support. We're also preparing and sharing meals, doing basic housekeeping activities, et cetera. So it evens out. But even there, I don't think it's reasonable to expect that there will be better than a 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 ratio of care partners. I think we just have to work smarter with who we have. And organizations that have eliminated antipsychotics have shown us that this can be done without changing staffing ratios, if they're reasonable to begin with.
So here's a question. How helpful are memory cafes and day programs in the continuum care, and especially in context of enhancing well-being?
I think, once again, that they can be very helpful. And there are lots of so-called memory cafes, Alzheimer's cafes, day programs, et cetera, et cetera. The important thing is, what do they do? It's just like saying, are nursing homes good or bad? Well, it depends. I think that for people particularly living in the community or living in assisted living or senior communities, it can be very important to have a place where people can engage. It may be beyond the capacity of a lone family member to provide that kind of engagement all day, plus that family member may need time to engage in other affairs or just to rest. So I think that these can be extremely important. But once again, if they are not empowering people, if they're not addressing well-being, if they are just kind of entertaining, if they are stigmatizing people, then they may not be doing that much good. So we want a place that's really engaging, empowering. Places that are inclusive can be great too. It doesn't just have to be people with dementia, but as a model that I would recommend, and there are many out there, I don't want to exclude people, but the people I've been working with recently, go look up the work that they're doing with the respite ministry in Alabama that Daphne Johnston followed. founded. Just look up Respite Ministry, United Methodist Church in Montgomery. She also has a branch in Birmingham, but she has started other ministries, faith-based ministries around the country, and just spoke in Australia last year about it. She is engaging people in a truly meaningful way, and they have. It's an all-volunteer run, other than her and a little support staff. It's all volunteer run. They fill shifts with dozens and dozens of people that come in. Everybody wears a first name tag. Nobody says I'm a person with dementia or I'm a volunteer. And they are doing service projects. They're engaging in a variety of ways. And so once again, there's only a limit to your own imagination as far as what you can do with these. So once again, it's good to have them, but go see them for yourself. Don't just take the word Memory Cafe and assume it's going to be a good place. Find out what's going on there and see if it's right for you.
Great. So how do you counter the argument that care staff don't have the time to deliver person-centered care because they are so task-driven in their duties, and they don't see the point of trying soft skills as important or critical to the overall care provision?
Yeah, well, there are many aspects to that. I'm gonna share a few arguments, and some may apply more in some organizations than others. First of all, when you get to the task-driven, I do want to quote my Australian colleague, Daniela Greenwood. Daniela really pushes back against that language because she says, you know what, it is the system that is time and task-oriented, not individuals. That is not our natural tendency, and it's almost, Daniela says, a type of victim blaming to say that it is the people who are task-oriented, because you're forced to do that. If you work in a system where they say the breakfast trays are coming at 7:30, you got to get 8 people up, of course you're going to be task-focused because that's what you're getting paid to do. So the truth is, and there's a myth that I have been guilty of spreading around in all my culture change training over the years, and that is that institutions were created because we favor efficiency over seeing unique individuals and relationship-based care. The truth is, there's nothing efficient about institutional models of care. Focusing on time and tasks is actually inefficient because it makes you do things that don't follow people's unique needs, that actually cause distress, that make you, rotating team members makes you constantly change your workday, constantly change the way you interact with the group of elders you have, with your team members who now have a different assignment and have different schedules in their day. It throws a monkey wrench in everything you do. And forget about culture change initiatives. When you're constantly changing up your own assignments, you can't possibly take on new initiatives. So actually putting forth the effort to changing the system creates efficiencies, creates time you didn't know you have. And I know the people I know that worked at the greenhouses up in Rochester say, you know what, I had to float over and fill a shift back at the Legacy home, and I'm so glad I'm doing this now. I don't ever want to go back to working that way. And people that have started using very consistent assignments through programs like the one that Daniela Greenwood has created say, this is so much better than what I used to do. I have so much more time than what I used to have. I know people better. There's less distress. I'm feeling less burned out. So once again, I think that we get in the system and we can't see our way out of it. And it seems like it's going to be harder, and change is always hard. And it always takes some trust and some effort and a little extra work at the beginning. And that's why leadership is as important as our direct support members when it comes to initiating change, because they have to help shepherd that, help support you, help give you the resources you need to undergo those tough changes. But when you get there, if you do it well, you're going to be in a better place.
So here's one I think is a great question. How do you get a medical director on board to change the prescribing practices?
I think the best way to do it is to get ourselves on board. When I started writing my first book, I'd never published any nonfiction books before, and I didn't know how to go about it. And so I started reading some books about it. And one of the first books I read said, the first thing you need to do is figure out who your core audience is for your book. And I immediately stopped reading, and I said to myself, well, I want everyone to read my book. And I went back to the book, and I swear the next thing he wrote was, I know you want everyone to read your book, but what you really need to do is figure out the core audience, because even though you will have a wide readership, the words you choose, the stories you tell, the situations you use for examples are going to be pointed at one group in particular, who are your core audience. And when I thought about that, I decided, you know what, I don't want my core audience to be doctors. I want doctors to read my book, and many of them have. But the core audience to me are the professional care partners, because the truth is that you decide more than doctors do who gets an antipsychotic. And you decide that by picking up the phone and saying, we have a problem with so-and-so. Most doctors don't walk into a greenhouse or into a neighborhood saying, okay, who can I give a pill to today? They are called in by people who are pushed to the limit, who don't know what to do, and they say, Mr. Jones is out of control, please help. They don't say, tell us how to bathe Mr. Jones differently, because they don't ask doctors about that. They just say, we need help. And when you're a doctor and the one skill you have other people don't have is prescribing drugs, then that's what doctors assume you want when you call them up. So we have to start engaging doctors differently. We have to start saying, can you come to a team meeting? Can you help us brainstorm what might be going on? Help us figure out what else we can do. And I felt that if I could give these tools to the team and help them brainstorm these things before they pick up the phone, then doctors will follow suit. It's a little hard to get to doctors, I realize that, and they sometimes can be a little bit hard-headed. But what I have found when I go to places that have eliminated antipsychotics and ask them how they got doctors on board, that they tell me the same thing every time. They say, you know what, the doctors pretty much follow our lead. If we're not calling them up asking for pills, they don't force them on us. If we call them up, of course they're going to give us a pill. But when they see that people are doing well and that we seem to have found a solution, they are usually satisfied with that. So I think that we have to work hand in hand. I invite you to share these lessons, to share this webinar, share the books with your medical partners. But by really modeling this and by bringing it to them, you have a better chance of success than just trying to get them to lead, because doctors are not leaders in culture change. They mostly have a private practice. They're coming in periodically. They don't have the time or the knowledge to lead culture change. So they just have to be brought on board like anybody else. And I think it's really on our shoulders. I say our, not meaning doctors, our meaning the people who are working directly with the elders, to take the lead and to help educate medical practitioners. Once again, they're good people that just need to get outside that box, and we can help them do that.
That's great. So one more question. If people are so interconnected, then would having a roommate that is compatible be a good intervention for connection?
I don't think it is, and I will share the arguments I put in Dementia Beyond Disease. In the security chapter, I talked about the practice of double rooms or multiple rooms, which of course Greenhouse has eliminated, but which is still seen in legacy homes and other places. And I'll tell you something funny. If I go speak, as I often do in most parts of Europe, or in a place like Australia or New Zealand, and I start talking about double rooms or semi-private rooms, they look at me like I have two heads. Like, what are you talking about? You mean everybody doesn't have their own room? And not only that, but everybody doesn't have their own door that they can lock from the inside? And you mean people don't have a shower in their room? You actually put them in a gown and drag them down the hall? People in other parts of the world are astounded that this has become standard practice in the US. So in my book, Under Security, I mentioned that, not having privacy. Privacy is a part of security, because it's not just physical safety, it's emotional, psychological security. And I believe personally, and I said that any new building or renovation should offer only private rooms. I have not yet spoken to an administrator or an architect in the world that if they got hit by a car and had brain damage and went to long-term care tomorrow, would choose a semi-private over a private room if I offered them one with a roommate I choose for the rest of their lives. And so I say, why do you keep building them? Now, the argument has been two arguments. Number one, people often are distressed and they feel safer when there's someone in the room with them. And the second one is people often form nice friendships with their roommates. And those are both valid, but these are my counter arguments. Number one, humans are adaptable people. And when you have to live with somebody day and night, you do tend to form friendships, because that's how we cope. That's what we did in college when we got forced with a roommate that we may or may not have wanted to choose for ourselves, because we're adaptable creatures. But, we may have best friends that we hang out with all the time, but we don't sleep with them necessarily. We don't share a bathroom with them. We don't share their space 24/7. And secondly, I think that the reason people are distressed is because we are not proactively supporting security. So in many legacy homes, we may have people that come and go in and out of rooms, team members who walk into someone's room without permission, who open their drawers, who touch them without asking permission, who don't respect those room or personal boundaries. We may have alarms going off. We may have overhead pages. We have noises outside the room that may cause people distress. We may rotate our team members so that they don't know who's going to come in and take off their clothes. And when we do these, we erode people's sense of security. So of course, the person in the room with them who they recognize might be a Band-Aid. But when people have those things that are supplied, when they have a full security glass, they don't need that person because they're not feeling threatened and scared all the time. So once again, we do it as a Band-Aid for providing an environment that doesn't give people a sense of security. I personally believe that there are a few things that people should have absolute privacy for. Getting dressed and undressed, sleeping, using the toilet, bathing, and having private conversations, and even having intimate relations with a loved one. And I think there needs to be a space for everybody in long-term care to do that. And I reject the argument that it's cheaper because the greenhouse has proven through their studies that the cost for the building, the cost for operations is the same or less with private rooms with ensuite showers as it is with multiple person rooms. And then when you add the soft costs of moving people because of roommate conflicts, because of infection control issues, you can see that there really are no good arguments for that. So I know we're at the top of the hour. Those are my arguments. I know the greenhouse stands behind me because that's one of their non-negotiables. But I hope that gives you.
Absolutely. Al, thank you so much. This was so informative, and I'll have you kind of advance through the next slides.
Absolutely.
If you liked what you heard here, you're going to really appreciate our webinar series. Al kind of alluded to the privacy in a room. Ann Ellett will be at some point during our series talking about sexuality and the person living with dementia. So kind of building on some of those concepts that Al has talked about. Next week, though, I'm really excited to launch our workforce hot topic. And Danny O'Brien is the CEO of a home care agency who has done amazing things as he has kind of recruited an amazing number of really talented workers. And he's going to talk about why culture matters and how to really recruit and retain talent. In addition to that, we've got our dementia series that will be kind of happening after that. You see those dates. You can go to our website to learn more about each of those webinars and events. Jennifer Carson, Imi Kyoto, and Ellett will all be a part of this. And the next slide, we'll talk to you a little bit about our workshops and all the ways that you're able to see a greenhouse up close and personal. And last but not least is our Dementia Symposium. So I invite you to visit our website and to really join us in our quest to learn, to grow, and to make a bigger impact in our communities. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and we look forward to seeing you at next week's webinar. Take care.
Thanks,
have a great week. Thanks, Al.
Bye-bye. Okay, I'm on.